Hello, this is a talk that I gave a while back for the Heritage Group, and I'm re-recording it now that we're in virus lockdown so that more folk can see it and anyone who missed it can see it again. So, Lost Buildings of Aldbourne. There's quite a few buildings that have been lost over time, and it's just interesting to see them. So we're going to take a bit of a tour of the village and just see what we can see. So, there are some known unknowns. You'll recognise that photo if you keep up with American politics. Roman, we know roughly speaking where they were. We know North Farm, and we know down near, somewhere near Barnes Yard and out at Paws Gorse, but we don't really know what the buildings were like very much. That's a whole other research project for years to come. We do know that in the fires, lots of buildings, and you can see the list there, were lost, including a lot of barns. That's going to be something we're going to come back to, that there used to be a lot more barns in the village than we're used to now. So, I live at Mow Cop, so that is, forgive the finger, there. So the W is a well, that's a little circle in front, but the grey building here isn't there anymore. That's just our front garden and next door's front garden. So that's a bit interesting. This goes to show that Know Your Place, which is a website which has different OS maps, and this is the earliest OS map that we have available for this area. It has some interesting things in it, although they're lost. We don't know what those buildings were. So if we jump forward to the next OS map, you can see the buildings in the front have gone, but we've gained this one here now. So that's slightly odd. And we come on a bit more, and now my back garden is absolutely stock full. It's not now. So that's just outbuildings, so that's just starting at home for me. So we head on up the hill. Not so much lost, but they are changed a bit. There's not as much, anywhere near so much thatch as there was. You notice the preponderance of wells around. Having a look at the earliest OS maps, there's an awful lot of wells around the village. It's quite normal to have one for every few houses. Similarly, heading on up the hill. So we get to Windmill Close, so it's not going to surprise anyone that there was a windmill there. That's the current OS map, and if we go forward, that's the old one. Back, oops, where are we? Back, back, full. So we can flick between the two, so you can tell where the windmill was. The windmill, unsurprisingly, is that round building. So we know that the windmill was there. That's what it looked like. Obviously, by the era of photography coming along, the windmills were looking a bit ramshackle because the steel mills were taking over, and by the 20s, stone ground flour had been made illegal for human consumption, which really was the death knell for windmills. It's now legal again, but that's another one of the windmill as it was. That's the destruction in progress, so you can tell how they did it. Great big traction engine, which presumably they tied a rope or a chain around some key element and just pulled. It was demolished by a Mr. H.C. Waite in 1900. And there we are, another shot. I love the policeman, who's when you look at that photo up close, the uniform was very Keystone Cops. It's nowhere near as smart as the uniforms now. The photo on the right is modern. Those are the steps leading up to one of the cottages there, which are the old millstones. So you can still get elements of the mill around. So we'll come back down the hill now. This building on the left is James Bridgman's house, one of the bell makers, and according to Terry, that burned down in the 1950s. That's not been replaced. That's it's not all infill and gaining houses all the time. Back down to the blind house, or the pound, somewhere on that triangle of grass, and we've tried finding it with rods into the soil and haven't managed to find it, was a lock-up. According to Morris Green, it was octagonal with an oak door, an iron grille above, and the only furniture was a slab of slate. Let me just tweak a little bit more of the. There you go. A slab of slate, and apparently the last drunk to be locked up in there overnight was a chap called Woodley. There are tales told of drunks being fed beer through the grille above the oak door via a teapot. So, yeah, I don't know, anyone's quite desperate enough for that now, but so coming on down, just uphill of the Memorial Hall, you can see there an old barn, and below that's the building that's now complete. In its place. For a while it was just a bit of a derelict site, and that's a slightly better view of it. Of course, we can't help but notice both these photos as folk wandering up and down the middle of the road, not a care in the world. Even with coronavirus, I wouldn't care to really do that. But yes, a little old barn. Now, we are told that the original social club was a Nissen hut. We don't have any photos of that, so if anyone has a photo, that would be interesting. And beyond that, apparently somewhere behind the library, according to Morris Crane, there was a rope walk and another in Back Lane. Interesting that there's having two rope walks in an inland village. You know, what were we doing with all the rope? It's not as if we had a navy. But who knows? Now, down at the junction, once again, stood in the middle of the road, taking photographs. The building on the left here has now declined into an outhouse. Also note the lack of trees. That photo is somewhere between the walls, and there's virtually no trees. Which is a recurrent thing if you're going through all our old photos. Once again, that's another painting of that building on the very right hand side that's now not really there in the same way. Okay, so part 2. This is fun. Looks like the camera does about 8 minutes at a go. So yes, the workhouse burnt down 1819. 1835 were part of the Hungerford Poor Law Union, but the actual act wasn't repealed until after the latest millennium. So everyone was paying a lot of attention to that, weren't they? So if we're talking about workhouses, it's not like the thing on the left. It would be very much more like the one on the right, which is at at Grafton. For humbler. Smithfield House, so just there left of the pump. I don't know if it was called Smithfield House then, but apparently the butchers had a slaughterhouse out back. This was demolished in 87 to be replaced by a very 80s building. Another shot of it there. And there, that's a 1949 photograph that was taken by a guy who did postcards. Once we reopen, hopefully we'll have this particular image up for sale. two more photos there from different angles, both from Friths, and a particularly old image there that shows you both the previous one that we were talking about and Smithfield House. Still no trees there, you notice it's much barer, and the pond level was quite a bit higher. We'll come back to water levels. Glebe Barn, if we sort of turn around and look the other way, big old long barn that used to be just where, unsurprisingly, Glebe Close is now. There's a few photos of that. That's it looking a bit decrepit. An aerial photograph from 1929, so you can see it wasn't just the one barn. We also had other buildings in behind it, other barns, a whole farm complex, and also you can see some of Hightown stables, but we'll come on to them in a little while. And that's it looking the other direction in the aerial photograph. Thomas Orchard's chair factory, running for about 40 years from 1887. It was at One Ash on South Street. Apparently before that it was up on Castle Street near the saw pit. And it was for a time in two barns at Neal's after a fire. I guess all that wood would be easy to have a fire. So mills. In the Doomsday Book there were 4 mills. The chances are those were all water mills. Later on we've got Windmill Field. That would have probably been a mill like the drawing you see down below. But after the 1500s there's no trace of it, other than the fact that the name is still, field name is still Windmill Field. So the original mills, oh yes, while we're looking at the map there, we do also notice there's a brick kiln ground, which rather suggests there was a brick kiln. So yes, back onto water mills. That's probably what they were like. That actual image is one from Ukraine, but it's about the simplest form of water mill you can get. An undershot, fairly simple structure. The undershots are way less efficient. But for us to have 4 mills does rather suggest that the groundwater levels were higher, and probably something like year round. Not surprising, nationally we abstract 7 million cubic metres of water a day. That's just an insane volume. And 1/4 of that is in the Thames region, so if you weren't abstracting any of that, other than the odd well, and they're not going to take very much, that's going to make a heck of a difference, especially around here to the water levels. So maybe these wet winters where we see the Bourne running almost full, something more like what it would have been almost year round. So there's a suggestion that for those water mills they'd have had to have been along the line of the Bourne, so out along South Street somewhere. Also down here we've got Malthouse or Prospect Farm. They're now replaced by the nursing home. You can see in that image Glebe Barn has gone but hasn't yet been replaced. And up at the top right we've got the old council houses. So there used to be, I believe it was 8 houses or 8 buildings with large gardens. A lot of that generation of buildings, it was presumed that everyone was going to have to grow their own food. And then that was replaced with 30 modern ones. And here we are with some of the destruction. So coming round up Farm Lane, we hit the football pitch and the military camp. So going across the top right corner is South Street, off that towards the centre is Farm Lane. Right at the centre you've got the turn in to the where the changing rooms are, the old cookhouse I think it was, or wash house. So that whole camp there, obviously, long gone, and you can see the gardens of the council houses rather nicely there. If we swing around into the Butts is an interesting one. This is where we've lost more buildings than gained. So you can see there's a whole cottage there to be replaced by just a fairly humble looking little garage. And there we had a whole line of cottages. Who would have guessed it? Had those survived, I think those would undoubtedly been listed. And there we can compare. Now you've got certainly more dwellings. And in the centre of the old OS map we have a saw pit. Obviously of interest on an OS map because saw pits are ready-made slit trenches. And there we have an unusual photograph of a saw pit in use. And you'd maybe manage to get about 12 boards a day as opposed to 200 from a water-driven mill, so yeah, I'm not surprised how the saw pits went after a while. So you can see there in the map below there's other ones around the village as well, just off near Castle Street and Marlborough Road, and another one out along West Street. You imagine we'd have at 12 boards a day you'd need multiple saw pits just to keep up with the demand. So carrying on up Marlborough Road we get to the egg factory, and that was built in 1949 and extended in 1960. The Millennium Book describes it as being built on a Civil War cemetery, so they must have found something prior. So there's on the very right hand side there's a tiny element of the egg factory visible there. But before the factory, what did they find? Well, when they were developing Valley View, this is normal now, it was an archaeological dig. They found pre-Roman pottery, Romano-British pottery, knives, a nice Saxon seax, a bone comb, and a mid-Saxon cemetery. So plenty of stuff there. The grave alignments they reckon was somewhat different. Some were more on an east-west alignment, suggesting Christian. The others maybe weren't Christian. No sign of coffins. There we have a map of the site. The difference in the alignment of the graves isn't huge, but we have to, I guess, trust their compass. But it all matches the alignment of the road, which does suggest that the road was already there, which is rather nice. So if you live on Marlborough Road, it's a seriously old road. There we are, developing the site after all the archaeology's done. So out along Castle Street you'll get to Lewisham Castle. A ditched ringwork. So found some medieval traces there in the 19th century. Maurice Crane suggested it was occupied by Louis the Dauphin in 1216, when the barons had invited the French over to displace King John. Obviously that whole tactic was abandoned. It would be lovely to prove that or not. Oops. Right. So up near Woods End and Cheldene we have a banjo enclosure. These are Iron Age, late Iron Age even, and there's still some debate over whether they're a special thing or whether they're just a small farming settlement or some prestige settlement or even some sort of ritual thing. There's research being done, but it's just nice to know we have a banjo enclosure. The old restroom, or old church room, that is not a photo of it. I do not have a photo of it. I thought that photo was, but I got corrected when we did the talk at the Methodist church, so ignore that. So back down to the square. This is when the square was a square. The building there, which is knocked down in the 1950s to widen the road, would have actually made the square very much more square. The left-hand side of it is where the Chinese now is, and what used to be a small butcher's. But that was a butcher's in its time as well. And that's a square on shot of how it looked. So turning round on the square, we get to Barnes Yard. A couple of shots there of Barnes Yard actually in use. I'm glad I wasn't a bus driver trying to get those vehicles in and out. That doesn't look easy. A couple of ground level shots of Barnes Yard in use. And as typically, when that was redeveloped into housing, they had to do an archaeological dig and found signs of Romano-British occupation, including the piece of skull that seemed to have been polished. That the best they could come up with as an explanation is that it was a skull cap. It was a piece of skull used as a cup, which is fairly gruesome. But if you like your horrible histories. Coming around West Street, we get to Jerram's Yard. He bought it in 1936. Had been a yard of a farm, and it was redeveloped in 1992-93. And there we are. We can see the redevelopment. I think it's Honey Pot Cottage now. And there we are. That's how it is now, at least how it was a year or two ago. Just left of that on West Street, it was the Primitive Methodist Chapel, 1840. Some cottages were converted in 1906. Chapel was built. 1936 it was extended. Well, interestingly, this photo must be fairly close to that, because we've got a very distinct change in the roof slate wear, and this stone looks a lot newer. So this photo is probably not far too long after 36, and it was still in use by the beginning of the 80s, but soon to be converted or knocked down and built on. And that's it just before it went, and how it is now, just cottages. Further along, we've lost a pond and some other buildings. We could do a whole talk on lost dew ponds. And turning around the other angle, we can see the real lumps and bumps in the field of where the buildings were. I think William Brown said that they were farm buildings that got burnt down. So talking of farm buildings, Woodley's barn, there isn't one there now, but that is only one of two shots that I'm aware of, and apparently a tree fell onto it and managed to partially demolish it. So and there we are, just I would imagine not too long before it was demolished, according to that, in 1976. So coming back round and up Back Lane, we get to Zoar Chapel, a small chapel converted from cottages in 1841, and then purpose-built chapel in 1868. This isn't unusual for the village about that time. There were an awful lot of non-conformists of various types, Certainly by about 1931 or just after, it was demolished. So there's very few photos. We do have one postcard that I think shows a gable end of it, but that's about all. But that's the burial ground that does still exist and has about half a dozen grave markers in it, and occasionally a few sheep, I think. Obviously, if you can carry on back up to the end, you get to the school. 1783, they were using a room over the porch as a school of the church as a school. 1839, a national school with 2 rooms was built. 1856, they extended it in the Gothic style, added a master's house, and in 1873 an infant's room was added. And we've got a few photos. May 1966, so not very long before it was demolished. I think by that time the new one had been built, and you can see there the 2 together. So if we come back round into the green, we get to number 8, where there used to be a shop, rather charming looking shop, and this was taken in about 1911, we think. That's the coronation flags out. Probably slightly older, because there we can see the building behind it. It's also got thatch as well. So the malt house, where Beech Knoll is now, it predates 1820 to 1840 when Beech Knoll was built. There's not very much more we know about that. So the malt house with the gone on. Racing stables, it's not just the ones at Hightown. We've had Victoria County history references being the old rectory in the early 20th century, and in Lottage in 1910. But Hightown is the obvious one, and we've got nice photos there of the stable layout. So quite a big establishment. It existed before 1921. Apparently there was a fire about then when both Adam and Eve, the fire engines, were used, and was used up till about the 70s and dismantled in about the year 2000. Some of it going over to a museum in America, because of course they're interested in because some of the Band of Brothers had been put up in the stables during the war. Another angle of the stables. So coming back round towards the end now, we get into Lottage Road and the Wesleyan Methodists. There's a reference to their chapel being in existence in 1807, but this particular site was built on in 1844, but then in 1868 the Wesleyans and the Methodists united. So at that point they'd have been occupying the chapel out on West Street, and this site was redeveloped into a building that we'll have a look at shortly. But that's how it used to be. You can see there on the left here we have actual thatch, so the cottage used to run right up to that building, but then hey presto, it doesn't any longer. So another example of cottages being lost. And that photo we think is a 1920s Sunday school outing. Interesting to notice that the ladies got a couple of pews in the back of the builder's truck, but the guys didn't. They just had to sit on the floor. And there it is, not long before it got demolished and replaced with that which turned into a youth centre, I believe, and then in time that also got replaced by the current existing Methodist chapel, and that's where we normally do our talks. So I hope that was of interest, and we'll try and get you some more talks out soon. Thank you.